History tells us the Battle of the Bulge was a shocking surprise, that the Allies were caught sleeping, that Germany's last gamble came out of nowhere. That version is comforting. It is also wrong. The most disturbing truth about the Battle of the Bulge is not how unprepared the Allies were, but how prepared one man actually was. The attack was not invisible, the warning signs were not subtle, and the disaster that followed was not inevitable. One general saw exactly what was coming, planned for it in advance, and was dismissed as paranoid while everyone else celebrated victory too early. While Allied headquarters declared Germany finished, one commander quietly prepared for an attack everyone insisted was impossible. That preparation, ignored, mocked, and nearly overridden, became the single reason the German breakthrough failed to split the Allied armies in half. It is the reason the 101st Airborne survived, and it is why the Ardennes did not become the graveyard of the Western Front. If you stay with this story to the end, you will see the hidden decision that changed the course of World War II, and why George S. Patton was the only general truly ready for the greatest ambush of the war. The men gathered inside the old French barracks at Verdun had spent their entire lives studying maps, but none of those maps had ever looked like this. It was the morning of December 19, 1944. Frost clung to the shattered window frames as if the cold itself were trying to hold the building together. The walls were scarred by shellfire from a war long past, now hosting another war spiraling out of control. Inside, senior Allied commanders stood shoulder to shoulder around a long wooden table, its surface carved and burned by previous conflicts. No one spoke above a murmur, no one smiled, and no one dared to look directly at the widening red bulge spreading across the Ardennes. 3 days earlier, the Germans had erupted from the forest with a force that defied every Allied assumption. Panzer divisions poured through terrain considered impassable. Entire regiments vanished in the opening hours. American units woke to artillery fire instead of breakfast. Communications collapsed. Roads choked with refugees, wrecked vehicles, and retreating soldiers. The front, so carefully drawn on Allied maps, no longer existed. This was not supposed to happen. Every intelligence estimate said the Germans lacked fuel, that their army was broken, that they were incapable of mounting a major offensive. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, held by inexperienced divisions sent there to rest. Senior commanders believed the war in Europe was entering its final chapter. Everyone believed that except George S. Patton. Weeks earlier, Patton had studied the same intelligence reports and reached a very different conclusion. He noticed German units disappearing from the front, rail traffic increasing at night, radio silence where there should have been chatter. To Patton, these were not signs of collapse. They were signs of preparation. He warned his peers. He warned his superiors. He argued that if the Germans attacked, they would strike through the Ardennes, precisely because no one expected it. The response was polite dismissal. Some thought Patton was chasing ghosts. Others believed his constant readiness was nothing more than ego and obsession. So Patton did what he always did. He prepared anyway. Quietly, without announcement, Patton drafted contingency plans. He rehearsed rapid troop movements. He positioned units so they could pivot north on short notice. His Third Army trained not for pursuit, but for emergency reaction. While other commanders planned victory parades, Patton planned disaster. When the German offensive exploded on December 16, Allied headquarters fell into chaos. Patton did not. By the time the generals met at Verdun, the situation was already dire. Bastogne was surrounded. The 101st Airborne was cut off. German armor was driving hard toward the Meuse River. If the Germans succeeded, the Allied armies would be split in two. As the room filled with confusion and grim silence, Patton broke it. He did not ask what could be done. He told them what he was already doing. Patton announced that his army would pivot 90 degrees, abandon its current offensive, and attack north within days, not weeks. Days, the room went silent, not with relief but disbelief. Moving an entire army in winter across frozen roads under enemy pressure was considered impossible. Patton had already rehearsed it. Within hours, Third Army began the largest and fastest operational pivot in American military history. Columns of tanks and trucks rolled through snow and ice, engines running day and night. Soldiers slept beside their vehicles. Supply officers performed miracles. And when the relief force finally smashed into Bastogne, it shattered the German timetable. The breakthrough stalled. The Bulge collapsed. The war in the West was not lost, because one man refused to believe comforting lies. The Battle of the Bulge was not a surprise attack. It was a warning ignored. And George S. Patton was the only general who listened. Forward observers were reporting armored formations where there were supposed to be only remnants. And the 101st Airborne, the toughest light infantry division the United States had, was now surrounded in a freezing Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne. If Bastogne fell, the Germans would punch a corridor straight toward Antwerp, split the Allied armies in half, and possibly force a political crisis on the Western Front. The possibility was unthinkable. Yet it was happening. At the head of the table sat Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. He had seen catastrophe before, North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, but nothing like this. A massive enemy offensive forming in what the Allies themselves had labeled a quiet sector. Every intelligence report of the past month had echoed the same comforting narrative. The Reich was exhausted, broken, incapable of major action, but the lines on the map said otherwise. They bent inward like fractures in a sheet of ice. Fractures spreading faster than anyone could reinforce them. One by one, senior officers whispered assessments to one another. The 106th Division is gone. Goddard. The road network is collapsing. And no reserves in position. E-7. The weather's grounding air support was won. It was won. The weight of the situation pressed down on the room until Eisenhower lifted his head. He looked not at the map, but at the men. His voice was calm, but it cut through the noise like a blade. Who can attack north, and how soon? 8-8. The question dropped over the table like a stone. A few pens stopped moving. Several officers leaned back in their chairs, calculating the impossible in their heads. To disengage divisions already fighting in poor terrain. To pivot an entire army north through winter storms. To coordinate fuel, ammunition, traffic control, and communications on roads now clogged with refugees and retreating units. None of it was feasible in the timeline demanded. It wasn't just difficult. It was beyond the limits of operational doctrine. Silence spread, slow and suffocating. Every general in the room knew what Eisenhower was truly asking. Who can reach Bastogne before it is crushed? Who can move faster than the German timetable? Who can strike while the enemy still believes the Allies are paralyzed? One man finally shifted in his seat. George S. Patton, he did not clear his throat. He did not soften the blow. He simply answered, I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. God, with this starting for a moment. No one breathed. Patton's reputation for aggression was legendary. Everyone in the room knew that, but this wasn't bravado on a battlefield. This was a logistical commitment on a scale that defied physics. Tens of thousands of men, artillery trains miles long, tanks chewing through frozen mud, all uprooted and redirected in a window barely wide enough for a single regiment, let alone an army. Bradley stared at him. Smith frowned. Eisenhower's eyebrows rose ever so slightly. Everyone else in the room was doing the same math. 48 hours. Impossible. He must be bluffing. But Patton's expression never changed. No excitement, no swagger, no hint of doubt. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't improvising. And he wasn't reacting to the battlefield collapse they were all witnessing for the first time. Patton was ready because he had begun preparing for this exact moment 11 days earlier, when no one believed such an attack was even conceivable. No one else in the room knew it yet, but the most decisive counterattack of the European war had already begun. To understand why Patton could make a promise no other general dared to give, we have to step back 11 days to a moment when the war seemed almost won, and when the danger ahead was seen by only one man. It was December 9th, 1944. Snow fell lightly over the headquarters of the U-3rd Third Army in Nancy, France. Inside, Officers moved with the tired confidence of men who believed the end was finally in sight. Reports across the Western Front painted the same picture. The German army was shattered, retreating, bleeding out. Some American units were already talking about celebrating Christmas in Europe. On the surface, everything supported that optimism. Third Army was pushing into the Saar region. Resistance was stiff but weakening. The enemy seemed to have no reserves left, no fuel, no mobility, nothing resembling the might they once had. But deep inside the intelligence section of Third Army, Colonel Oscar was watching something terrifying take shape. Coe was not the kind of officer who relied on instinct or flair. He was methodical, slow, careful, annoyingly precise. Some said he didn't speak unless he had facts. And when he did speak, he expected people to listen. That morning, Koch walked into Patton's office, carrying folders stacked so high he could barely see over them. He set them down, opened one, and pointed to a map filled with small ink markings. "General," he began, "something is wrong on the German line." Axed Patton raised an eyebrow. Most intelligence briefings that month had been predictable, even dull. This one wasn't. Kay explained what he had been tracking for weeks. 15 German divisions, 15 had disappeared from the front. Not shattered units, not hollow formations, real divisions. Panzer divisions with tanks, mobile infantry, artillery, communications, logistics, the entire package gone, pulled back, hidden, unaccounted for. The official explanation from Shash intelligence was that the units had been withdrawn simply to create a reserve, a defensive measure. Perfectly normal, nothing to worry about, Koch disagreed. He laid out radio intercepts, movement reports, civilian observations of convoys traveling by night, interrogations hinting at reinforcements that shouldn't exist. The pieces formed a pattern Coe had seen before. He looked Patton in the eyes. "General, the Germans are not preparing to defend. They are preparing to attack. 8 days. Patton didn't interrupt. He didn't dismiss the conclusion. He didn't remind Coe that higher headquarters had said the exact opposite for weeks. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. Where, Jen? Coe's pencil traced a line across the map. A line pointing directly into the Ardennes forest. Patton leaned back. Of all the places Coe could have indicated, this was the one most Allied commanders would least suspect. The Ardennes to them was a natural barrier. Dense woods, narrow roads, brutal terrain in winter, terrible for tanks, a sector held by only 4 thinly spread American divisions because no major attack was expected there. But Coe reminded Patton of the uncomfortable truth. Germany had used that same terrain in 1940 to smash France in a lightning strike no one predicted. If they had done it once, they could try again. Patton's expression hardened. "What's your estimate?" he asked quietly. Coe didn't hesitate. "Within 2 weeks, I am." There was no theatrics, no drama, just raw analysis. Patton stood up, walked to the phone, and called his immediate superior, General Omar Bradley. Bradley listened politely. He respected Patton sometimes, but Schaff intelligence disagreed entirely. They insisted Germany no longer had the strength to launch a major offensive. They viewed Coe's conclusion as improbable at best and alarmist at worst. When Patton hung up, he stared at the receiver for a long moment. Then he turned back to Coe. "All right," he said. "Start planning work." 2 words, but those 2 words would shape the next 12 days and the fate of Bastogne. Coe and Patton's staff began drafting what few armies in history had ever attempted. 3 full contingency plans for rotating an entire army 90 degrees on short notice and launching a counter-offensive into unknown conditions. They created versions A, B, and C depending on where the German attack might break through. They charted roads, intersections, bridge capacities, traffic choke points. They identified which divisions could disengage fastest, which artillery groups could reposition, which fuel depots could be rerouted. It was not glamorous work. It was math and mud and cold fingers writing movement tables late into the night. And it was secret kept even from many senior officers within Third Army who questioned why they were wasting time on what seemed like hypothetical nonsense. Why prepare for a crisis that higher command insisted was not coming? Why pivot away from a successful advance? Why plan for a German attack when Germany was supposedly finished? Because Patton trusted his intelligence officer, and because Patton understood something most commanders never accept. If you wait for confirmation, you are already too late. By December 12th, Third Army had something no other Allied formation possessed: a complete set of instructions for how to break contact, turn north, and strike into the Ardennes at full speed. They were the only army in Europe with such a plan, the only army prepared for an attack no one else believed in. 3 days later at 5:30 a.m., the German artillery began to roar and Koh's warning became reality. Within hours, the Ardennes was burning. Divisions were collapsing, and headquarters across Europe were scrambling to understand what had happened. But at Third Army headquarters, Patton simply nodded. "You were right," he told Koh. "What's their objective if you why?" When Koh answered Bastogne, Patton didn't hesitate. "Get Gaffey on the line," he said. "We're executing the plans. Weak. The disaster that stunned the Allied command was a scenario Third Army had already rehearsed. Patton's counterattack didn't begin at Verdun. It began here in a quiet office lit by a single desk lamp. When a general believed the warning, everyone else refused to hear. December 16th, 1944 began like any other winter morning on the Western Front, cold, quiet, and brutally still. American soldiers stationed in the Ardennes called it a ghost sector, a place where units rotated in to rest, where the snow muffled sound and the forest swallowed movement. But at 5:30 a.m., the ghosts disappeared, the sky erupted. German artillery, thousands of guns, opened fire across an 80-mile front with a violence not seen since the opening days of the war. Trees splintered, communications trenches collapsed, field telephones went silent, their wires severed, entire platoon vanished before they were fully awake. What the Allies believed was the weakest stretch of the line was precisely where Hitler had concentrated his last remaining strength. 3 armies, 200 men, 400 tanks and assault guns, and enough ammunition for a full-scale offensive. Reports poured into headquarters across Belgium and Luxembourg. Sector collapsing. Infantry retreating without orders. Enemy armor confirmed, unable to contact the 106th Division. And then came the message no one wanted to hear. 2 regiments surrounded, overrun. The 106th Infantry Division, placed in the Ardennes for training because the sector was considered quiet, was being smashed to pieces. Within days, 2 of its regiments would surrender, marking the single largest American capitulation of the European War. At Shash headquarters, officers scrambled to interpret the chaos. Initial assumptions dismissed the attack as a local counterstroke, nothing more than desperate German attempt to slow the Allied advance. But every hour made that optimism harder to defend. More reports. Enemy paratroopers reported. Panzer Division identified. Allied artillery overrun. Civilians fleeing in mass. Road network collapsing under retreating units. The picture was becoming undeniable. This was not a counterattack. This was a major offensive, one the Allies had not prepared for except one man had. At Third Army headquarters, the reaction was entirely different. When Patton received the first report at dawn, he didn't swear. He didn't demand confirmation. He didn't ask for more details. He simply turned to Oscar Koh. "You were right," Patton said. "What's their objective was already studying the patterns, the direction of armored thrusts, the roads being seized, the timing, the pressure points. He needed only minutes to confirm what he had suspected all along. Bastogne," he said, "their advance depends on that junction." Patton nodded once, not in surprise, but in recognition. He stepped into the operations room. "Get me General Gaffey," he ordered. "We're executing the contingency plans." There was no shock among his staff, no confusion, no frantic redrawing of maps because Third Army had rehearsed this exact moment for days. Artillery units began shifting positions. Signal officers rerouted communication lines. Fuel depots prepared to redirect convoys north. Engineers reviewed which bridges could support armored columns. The most difficult task came next: disengaging frontline divisions already fighting in the SAR and pivoting them nearly 90 degrees in the dead of winter. This was a maneuver most military planners considered impossible under combat conditions. But Third Army wasn't improvising. They were following plans drafted in the quiet nights after Coe's warning, plans no other army on the continent possessed. Meanwhile, the German advance gained terrifying momentum. The 2nd Panzer Division punched through thin American positions, spreading panic along the roads. Vogue's grenadier units flooded the gap between towns, overwhelming small outposts before they could report back. Captured Allied vehicles, jeeps, trucks, even tanks, allowed German units to infiltrate deeper, sowing confusion in rear areas. Civilians ran from burning villages. American commanders at the front sent increasingly desperate messages. We need reinforcements now. We are outnumbered. Enemy armor breaking through. Urgent, but reinforcements weren't coming. Most Allied formations were oriented east or north, too far to influence the battle in time. Others were locked into offensives they could not easily break away from. When Eisenhower convened the emergency conference at Verdun on the 19th, he expected grim news, but he did not expect the near-total paralysis he saw in every face around the table. Every general was calculating how long it would take to move their forces north, and every one of them reached the same conclusion, not fast enough until Patton spoke. I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. The room froze. Bradley's jaw tightened. Smith nearly laughed. Even Eisenhower, a man who had seen Patton's brilliance and recklessness in equal measure, stared at him like he'd lost his mind. George. Eisenhower said carefully, "This is no time for showing off." Patton didn't blink. "Ike," he replied, "I've already issued the orders." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. This one was laced with something else. A realization spreading across the room. Patton wasn't boasting. He wasn't gambling. He wasn't guessing. He was prepared. Prepared because he had trusted the warning no one else believed. Prepared because he had spent 11 days building the only plan in the Allied arsenal capable of saving Bastogne. Prepared because he understood that when a commander waits for certainty, he forfeits initiative. Eisenhower leaned back. "All right, George," he said, "go." Patton didn't walk out of the room. He exploded out of it. The greatest rapid redeployment of the European war was already underway. The moment Patton left the conference room at Verdun, the countdown began. Not the countdown to an attack that had already started, but the countdown to whether a single American army could do the impossible faster than the Germans could finish their breakthrough. Patton strode into the hallway, grabbed the nearest field telephone, and barked 2 words that detonated across the Third Army Command network. Play ball. Anyone outside his circle had no idea what that meant. Inside Third Army, every senior officer knew exactly what it signaled. Execute the contingency plans. Turn the army north, move. Now the impossible maneuver. Most armies struggle to shift a single division under fire. Patton was about to pivot 3 corps tens of thousands of men while disengaging them from ongoing operations, and he had 48 hours. The scale of the movement bordered on the absurd. Over 133 zeros, Euro-0 vehicles, tanks, tank destroyers, half-tracks, and artillery, supply convoys, stretching for miles, medical columns, signal vehicles, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, reinforcement battalions, maintenance crews, engineers with bridging gear. All of it had to be reversed like a river forced to flow uphill. And it had to be done in the worst winter Europe had seen in decades. Snow fell in heavy sheets, turning roads to ice. Visibility dropped. Engines froze. Soldiers worked with numb fingers and faces stung raw by wind. Yet the movement didn't slow because Patton's staff had rehearsed every piece of it. In theory, days before the first German shell fell, traffic control a war within a war. As Third Army columns began pushing north, they collided almost immediately with streams of refugees and retreating American units pouring south. The result was a nightmare of movement. Civilians with carts, families carrying what little they owned, wounded soldiers on foot, shattered units marching in disorganized columns, military police trying, failing to maintain order. Into this chaos came Third Army's armored divisions moving at their highest sustainable speed. Traffic control officers compared it to trying to drive a city through a keyhole. MPs waded into intersections, screaming over engines, shoving wrecked vehicles off the road, directing tanks through spaces barely wider than their treads. In the freezing dark, headlights crawled along narrow routes like veins of fire pulsing through the night. Every mile fought for, every minute precious. The men who had to turn around. The most incredible part of the maneuver was not the movement. It was the disengagement. The divisions Patton needed were not on stand-by. They were fighting. Frontline commanders received orders that seemed impossible. Pull back under contact. Reassemble. Rearm, refuel, and march a 100 miles toward an enemy attack that no one else had anticipated. Units that had just taken objectives were told to abandon them. Artillery batteries were ordered to limber up and move immediately, even as German guns continued to fall around them. Infantry companies fought, delaying actions not to gain ground, but to extract their own forces from the line. It was war fought in reverse. One regimental commander later said, "We didn't withdraw. We peeled ourselves off the German line like tape from a frozen window." The fuel problem. Then came the next crisis. Filled tanks don't move without gasoline, and the distances involved meant Third Army needed tens of thousands of gallons repositioned instantly. Fuel depots scrambled to push supplies forward. Convoys were rerouted in real time. Quartermasters worked by lantern light, calculating burn rates, predicting where armored columns would stall, trying to guess which routes would still be intact by dawn. Drivers navigated icy roads by instinct, guided by MP waving flashlights like frantic beacons. One wrong turn, one stalled truck, and the entire supply line could choke. The plan within the plan Patton's three contingencies, Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, now unfolded like gears locking into place. If the Germans broke through east of Bastogne, Third Army would strike their flank. If they advanced farther west, Third Army would punch through the center. And if they drove deeper still, Third Army would launch a wide envelopment. Every staff officer knew their part. Every brigade commander understood their route. Every artillery group had its firing positions mapped. Before they even left the SAR, the miracle wasn't speed. The miracle was synchronization. December 19th, the first units reached the staging areas. By the time Patton made his promise at Verdun, the lead elements of his army were already moving. By nightfall on the 19th, units of the 4th Armored Division, his shock force, were reaching their staging grounds. Mechanics worked through the night in temperatures far below freezing, hammering ice from tracks, draining frozen oil, repairing engines pushed beyond safe limits. Infantrymen slept beside running motors just to stay warm. Artillery batteries dug in as soon as they arrived, setting fire missions before officers could even brief them. They weren't ready in 48 hours. They were ready sooner. Meanwhile, elsewhere on the front, other Allied formations were barely beginning to comprehend the scale of the German offensive. Some corps believed it was a diversion. Others assumed it was a last gasp. Some headquarters spent the entire night arguing over maps that no longer matched the terrain. One American general reportedly said, "This can't be happening. They don't have the strength." But they did, and Third Army was now the only force positioned to strike back. Before the German timetable reached its decisive point, every hour Patton gained, the Germans lost. Every mile his columns advanced, the fate of Bastogne shifted. Every decision made 11 days earlier was now paying off. The turn north was complete. The counterattack was ready, and the greatest armored dash of the Allied war was about to begin. By the morning of December 20th, the German advance was pushing deeper into the Ardennes like a steel wedge, driving through weak points, bypassing pockets of resistance, and outrunning Allied attempts to form a cohesive defense. But something had changed. For the first time since the offensive began, a major American army, Patton's Third, was moving toward the chaos instead of away from it. And the speed of that movement stunned even Patton's own officers. 4th Armored takes the lead. At the tip of the spear was Major General Hugh Gaffey's 4th Armored Division, a formation trained for rapid assaults, but never before asked to cross an entire theater in a winter storm and immediately launch a major attack. Gaffey received his final orders from Patton just before dawn. Your objective is bestowed. Patton said, nothing else matters. Breakthrough, no excuses. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even strategy. It was an ultimatum delivered with the certainty of a man who had already staked his reputation and the lives of thousands on the belief that this could be done. Gaffey saluted, mounted his Sherman command tank, and roared into motion. The men of the 4th Armored Division quickly learned that this was not going to be a normal advance. The roads were clogged, visibility low, temperatures brutal, convoys stretched for miles. Columns would grind to a halt at destroyed bridges, only to find engineers already there, rebuilding them in the dark under enemy air patrols. Nothing slowed them for long, the winter that tried to kill an army. Europe was locked in one of the worst winters in decades. Snow piled high along the roads, narrowing them until even jeeps struggled to pass. Tanks skidded on frozen surfaces, their treads screeching, engines groaning under the strain. Men rode exposed on half-tracks, their eyelashes freezing into white crystals, breath turning to ice the moment it left their lips. One sergeant wrote, "It felt like the weather wanted to stop us as much as the Germans did, but Third Army kept moving." Fuel trucks passed stalled columns. Medical vehicles plowed through drifts to reach wounded men frozen in the roadside snow. Tank crews slept in their vehicles, refusing to turn off their engines for fear they wouldn't start again in the morning. One private recalled waking up to find that the metal floor beneath him had frost patterns matching the shape of his body. German High Command notices the shift. Meanwhile, German commanders, still euphoric from the early success of the offensive, began to detect something troubling. Interrogated American prisoners insisted that Patton's army was moving north. Intercepted radio messages hinted at large-scale redeployments, and reconnaissance units reported unusual armored concentrations forming far from the main battle line. General von Monteuffel, one of the architects of the German attack, later admitted, "Patton moved faster than our intelligence believed possible." Hitler refused to believe it. He thought Patton was bluffing or that the Americans were retreating in confusion. No army, he insisted, could turn around that quickly in winter. He was wrong. Bastogne, the town that couldn't bend. Inside Bastogne, the situation worsened with every passing hour. The 101st Airborne Division, commanded in the absence of General Taylor by Brig General Anthony McAuliffe, had dug into the frozen ground as best they could. Paratroopers used snow for cover, their foxholes filling with ice water. Medical teams ran out of plasma and morphine. Artillery units rationed shells so severely that battery commanders counted each round like gold. The Germans surrounded the town completely by December 21st. Roads were cut. Ammunition low, food dwindling, medical supplies critically short. Still, the 101st refused every demand for surrender. Maliff's now famous reply, "Nuts," was not bravado. It was desperation wrapped in defiance. But defiance alone couldn't hold out forever. The paratroopers knew relief had to come soon or not at all. No one in Bastogne knew whether Patton's promise was real. Rumors spread in foxholes. Some swore Patton had already reached the outskirts. Others believed the High Command had abandoned them. Only one thing kept their morale steady, the belief thin as a knife edge that someone was fighting their way through the storm to reach them. December 22nd, the push begins. Patton launched the attack north on the morning of December 22nd. It was not a clean advance. German units had fortified every village, every forest edge, every crossroad. Machine gun nests waited behind stone walls. Anti-tank guns lurked at the bends of roads. Snow-concealed mines. Mortars fell with terrifying accuracy. 4th Armored clashed with German forces almost immediately. The village of Bougainville became a furnace of exploding shells and burning farmhouses. Infantrymen fought hand-to-hand in orchards coated in ice. Tank destroyers battled panzer grenadiers at ranges so close that men could feel the heat of flames bursting from tank barrels. To the west, the 26th Infantry Division pushed through drifts taller than a man, fighting not only enemy units, but the terrain itself. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. The pressure of time every hour mattered. If Bastogne fell, Patton's advance would become meaningless. If the Germans reached the Meuse River, the Allied front could collapse entirely. Patton spent the night pacing in his mobile command truck. chain smoking, listening to... Reports come in. 4th Armor delayed at Martelange. Enemy armor encountered near Ardennes was snow slowing movement visibility poor. Infantry exhausted, requesting relief. Patton refused to relent. Tell them to keep going. He said again and again. His staff watched him with a mixture of fear and awe. The man seemed to consume stress like fuel. The worse the situation became, the more energized he appeared because he knew something most commanders didn't fully grasp. The Germans were on a clock, and 3rd Army was the only force capable of disrupting it. A battle of miles. By December 23rd and 24th, Patton's spearhead was within striking distance of Bastogne. But the last miles were the hardest. A ring of German units tightened around the town, determined to hold it until reinforcements arrived. Everything now hinged on a single armored division, breaking through a shrinking window of opportunity before the Germans could seal it permanently. Patton's gamble was about to reach its climax. The fate of Bastogne and the entire Allied front rested on whether 4th Armored Division could smash the final defenses. The siege would not break on strategy alone. It would break on sheer will. Steel in the frozen hands of tank crews who refused to stop. The final dash was moments away. By December 24th, Patton's 3rd Army had done what no other Allied force could. It had reached the outer edge of the German ring surrounding Bastogne. But getting there was only the beginning. Between the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division and the encircled paratroopers of the 101st Airborne lay a network of villages, frozen fields, and wooded ridges that the Germans had fortified with ruthless efficiency. Every farm became a machine gun nest. Every crossroads hid an anti-tank gun. Every tree. Held infantry determined to stall the American advance long enough for German reinforcements to arrive. Patton's timetable was almost spent. He knew Bastogne was running out of ammunition, out of food, out of medical supplies, but most dangerously running out of time. Christmas Eve would become one of the bloodiest days of the rescue. The fight for Martelange and the frozen crossroads. The 4th Armored route forced them through a series of bottlenecks, any one of which could have delayed them long enough to doom Bastogne. At Martelange, engineers struggled for hours to repair a bridge blown by retreating German units. Tanks idled in deep snow, belching exhaust that mixed with the icy wind. Infantry crouched behind frozen stone walls, watching for enemy movement, while engineers hammered metal plates into place with hands stiffened by cold. Once across the bridge, armored columns advanced into narrow, twisting roads through dense forest. German units fought from behind felled trees and burning vehicles. Panzerfaust teams ambushed from icy ditches, disappearing back into the woods like ghosts. Tank commanders responded by firing into tree lines at point-blank range, the muzzle blasts lighting the forest in violent bursts of orange against the white snow. Progress was measured not in miles, but in crossroads, each one a miniature battlefield. Ardennes, the gateway to the 101st. By December 25th, the division had closed in on the village of Ardennes, the final obstacle before reaching Bastogne. The village was more fortress than settlement. Now, German troops had dug into every structure. Machine guns covered the open fields leading into town. Anti-tank guns waited at the intersection. Mortars were pre-sighted to fire on any American column daring to cross the open snow. Colonel Abrams, commander of Combat Command B, examined the terrain and made a simple assessment. We go through Ardennes or we fail. There were no alternate routes. The paratroopers in Bastogne were hanging on by threads. If the 4th Armored didn't break the ring now, the enemy would seal it permanently. Abrams ordered his men forward. The final charge. Sherman tanks lurched across the frozen fields, their engines roaring like beasts fighting against the cold. German machine guns instantly opened fire, tracer rounds, slicing red arcs across the snow. Mortars exploded among the infantry following the armored vehicles, throwing clouds of smoke and ice into the air. American artillery pounded the German positions, but the defenders held as tanks pushed into the outskirts of the village. Panzerfaust teams darted from alleys, firing at close range before sprinting back into cover. Sherman after Sherman was hit, some disabled, others burning. Yet the line did not stop. Abrams, calm under fire as always, radioed his officers. If you're scared, you're in the wrong outfit. Keep moving. The tanks surged deeper into Ardennes. House by house, room By room, American troops fought to clear the village. Flames climbed the walls of the stone buildings, casting long shadows of advancing infantrymen across the snow. German defenders began to break, first in small groups, then in waves. Abrams sensed the shift instantly. Push through, don't stop. Cobra King leads the breakthrough. At the front of the armored column was a Sherman tank with a name scrolled on its armor plate. Cobra King, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Bass. Cobra King barreled down the Assaninoa-Bastogne road, opposition thinning with every yard. The road was littered with smoking vehicles, abandoned bicycles, and discarded German equipment. The sound of battle receded behind them. Ahead lay only the frozen fields and the narrow road into Bastogne. Inside the tank, the crew barely spoke. Each man knew exactly what this moment meant. If they broke through, the siege was over. If they didn't, the 101st Airborne might be crushed within hours, at 4:50 p.m. On December 26th, as twilight settled over the Ardennes, a thin line of weary American infantry appeared ahead. Paratroopers in foxhole-stained jackets, faces hollow from days of freezing, rifles slung low. The moment they saw the Sherman tank, they lifted their hands, not in surrender, but in recognition. Hey, you guys from Patton. It was over. Cobra King had made physical contact with the 101st Airborne. Boney was relieved. A victory written in exhaustion. Exhausted crews inside the tank cheered weakly. Many didn't have the strength for more. The infantry of the 101st laughed, some cried. Others simply stared in disbelief. Behind Cobra King, convoys streamed into the newly opened corridor. Trucks with ammunition, jeeps carrying medical supplies, foil tankers, food crates, blankets, radio equipment, everything the 101st had been surviving without now poured into the town. German forces immediately counterattacked in an attempt to close the corridor, but they were too late. The link was established, and the paratroopers who had refused to surrender, who had fought, surrounded for 8 days in the cold, now had what they needed to hold. Patton's impossible 48-hour promise had become a reality. The relief of Bastogne was more than a tactical victory. It was a psychological one. It proved to both sides that German momentum had stalled, and that the Allies could regain the initiative even in the face of catastrophe. But the true significance of Patton's triumph was not yet understood by most commanders. The real story of why he was ready and why no one else had been was about to come into focus. Night fell over Beaune with a strange quiet, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of exhaustion. For 8 frozen days, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne had lived on a knife edge, fighting from snow-filled foxholes, rationing ammunition to single shots, treating the wounded with dwindling supplies, and waiting for a relief that many feared would never come. Now headlights pierced the darkness. Engines growled across the snow. American voices shouted orders from the newly opened corridor. Patton's men had arrived. The 101st didn't celebrate. They endured. There was no triumphant cheer, no dramatic raising of flags. Men were too tired, too cold, too drained from constant shelling. One paratrooper, leaning on his rifle for balance, looked at a tank commander and muttered, "Took you long enough." It wasn't sarcasm. It was relief wrapped inside fatigue so deep it didn't have room for celebration. Inside Bastogne, the wounded were finally evacuated. Doctors received morphine and plasma for the first time in days. Machine gun teams restocked belts that had run dry. Artillery crews wept when crates of shells were unloaded from trucks, their guns finally able to speak again. But for all the emotion of the breakthrough, everyone knew the fight was not over. The Germans would counterattack. They always did. Hitler's grand design begins to crumble. When the offensive began on December 16th, Hitler believed he had recreated the miracle of 1940, a massive blow through the Ardennes that would split Allied armies, create political chaos, and force the Western powers to negotiate. For a few days, it even looked possible. His panzer divisions punched deep into American lines. American units reeled. Refugees filled the roads. German soldiers boasted that they would be in Antwerp within a week. But by December 26th, the limitations of the German plan were becoming impossible to hide. They were short of fuel, short of reserves, short of winter clothing, short of time. And now, because of Patton, they were short of momentum. Every minute before Third Army's arrival, the German timetable tightened like a noose. Every minute after it began to unravel, the counterattacks begin. Within hours of the breakthrough, German commanders launched furious counterattacks to crush the corridor connecting Bastogne to Patton's forces. The villages of Clogimont, Seabret, and Shannon became battlegrounds illuminated by burning vehicles. American units fought through snow that swallowed their boots against machine guns hidden behind haystacks frozen solid. Tanks clashed at close range, their turrets glowing from repeated firing. The snow melting into muddy slush around their tracks, but the corridor held. Patton fed reinforcements into the line relentlessly. Infantry, tanks, artillery, engineers building a wall around Bastogne while expanding outward, pushing the Germans back inch by inch. Third Army was no longer racing against time. They were grinding the enemy down. The 101st Airborne holds the town inside Bastogne, morale transformed. Where there had been doubt, there was now defiance. Fresh ammunition changed everything. Doctors could treat the wounded properly. Artillery could fire counter-battery missions instead of hiding their last shells. German commanders, expecting the airborne troops to crumble, instead faced an enemy, now fully rearmed and angry. They launched repeated assaults on the perimeter. Probing attacks, infiltration attempts, armor thrusts supported by infantry. Every one of them was repelled. The defenders, once at the brink of collapse, had turned into a wall. Patton had flipped the battlefield on its head. The hunters were now the hunted. The German offensive stalls. By the last days of December, the once mighty German advance slowed to a crawl. Fuel shortages forced entire panzer units to abandon tanks in the snow. Frostbite incapacitated thousands of infantrymen. Roads jammed with wrecked vehicles. American artillery, now fully supplied, thundered across the battlefield with terrifying consistency. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundt surveyed the situation and said bitterly, "This offensive has failed. It has failed because our hopes were too high and our resources too low. The dream of reaching Antwerp was dead. The best the Germans could hope for now was to escape the trap they had created for themselves." Patton presses the attack. Patton, however, was not content with simply relieving Bastogne. He wanted to punish the German army for its ambition. He ordered a series of coordinated offensives to push the enemy back toward the start line, squeezing them from the south, while British and American forces applied pressure from the north and west. Snowstorms gave way to clearer skies, allowing Allied aircraft to strike German columns, retreating through narrow forest roads. The Luftwaffe was too weak to challenge the bombers. Every convoy struck was another blow to the German timetable. Slowly, steadily, the bulge the Germans had created began to collapse inward. What had begun as Hitler's last gamble was turning into a catastrophe. The strategic meaning of Bastogne. Military historians often debate whether Bastogne itself was vital or symbolic. The truth is it was both, tactically. The town's road network was essential for German logistics. Lose Bastogne, and the Germans lost their chance to exploit their early gains. Hold Bastogne, and the Americans kept a dagger pointed at the heart of the enemy advance. But the psychological impact was even greater. The relief of Bastogne proved that the German attack could be stopped. American forces could regroup under pressure. Patton's mobility was unmatched. Allied coordination, once aligned, was overwhelming. Most importantly, it showed the German troops who had entered the battle with confidence that the tide was turning. The myth of German invincibility died in the snow around Bastogne, and the myth of American paralysis died the moment Patton turned his army north. The bulge deflates as the new year approached. Allied forces tightened their grip on the fading German salient. By mid-January, the offensive that had promised Hitler a path to victory was reduced to scattered freezing units desperately trying to retreat. The Germans would never launch another offensive in the west. Bastogne had been their high water mark, and the man who prevented the tide from rising further was the same man whose warning everyone else had ignored. As the German offensive collapsed and Allied forces tightened the noose around the shrinking bulge, a fiat battle began, a battle not fought with tanks or artillery but with questions, hard questions, uncomfortable questions, questions that had no easy answers. How had 15 German divisions vanished from the front without triggering alarms across the Allied intelligence system? How had 200 enemy troops, hundreds of tanks, and vast stores of ammunition assembled for a major offensive, while so many senior commanders believed the Reich was finished. How had one officer, Oscar Coe, seen the danger so clearly, while entire intelligence sections at higher headquarters dismissed the possibility outright? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, why was George S. Patton the only major field commander who acted on that warning, the costliest assumption of the war? In the months leading up to the Battle of the Bulge, Allied intelligence painted a comforting picture. German morale was broken. Their armored divisions were depleted. They lacked fuel for major operations. Their logistics network was collapsing. Their air force was nearly gone. Every report across multiple channels reinforced the same narrative. The Germans could not attack. Not on a large scale, not through the Ardennes, not in winter. It was a conclusion repeated so often that it hardened into doctrine. Commanders didn't just believe Germany was finished. They needed to believe it. After months of fighting across France and Belgium, the Western Allies were exhausted. Supplies were stretched. Weather was deteriorating. Political leaders back home expected rapid progress. A major German offensive simply didn't fit the story that everyone wanted to be true. And so every piece of data that contradicted that story was quietly bent to fit the expectation. Oscar Coe refused to bend the data. Coe's brilliance was not intuition, it was discipline. Where others saw isolated anomalies, he saw patterns. Where others assumed German weakness, he measured German capability. Where others dismissed prisoner reports as rumors or exaggeration, he cross-referenced them with intercepted signals and logistical movements, and crucially, never tried to make the data tell a comfortable story. He looked at the facts and asked a simple question. If the enemy were preparing for a major offensive, would the evidence look like this? The answer was unmistakable. Disappearing panzer divisions, increased radio traffic, night convoys reported by civilians, shifting supply hubs, prisoners mentioning new units, reinforced command posts behind the Ardennes. Everything pointed to a single terrifying conclusion, but Coe understood something deeper. Intelligence only matters if someone is willing to act on it. Most commanders heard the warning and ignored it, briefed his findings up the chain of command. He didn't hide his conclusions. He didn't soften them. He didn't hedge his analysis. His message was clear. The Germans are preparing for a large-scale attack. Through the Ardennes within 2 weeks, the reaction, polite nods, reassuring smiles, and then dismissal. Chaff intelligence insisted their own analysis was sound. Bradley believed the Germans lacked the fuel and manpower. Other field commanders trusted the consensus. Most senior leaders weren't incompetent. They were anchored to an assumption that Germany was too weak to try something so daring. Coe was asking them to question everything. Few were willing to do so. Only one commander truly listened. Why? Patton took the warning seriously. Patton didn't believe Coe because he was paranoid. He believed him because he understood war as a system, not a collection of isolated movements. He knew Germany had surprised the West before, in 1940, using the same terrain that Allied intelligence now declared impassable. He knew the enemy fought hardest when they were cornered. And above all, he knew that ignoring a credible threat was far more dangerous than preparing for one that never arrived. So Patton made the call no other general was willing to make. He prepared his army for a disaster that did not yet exist and that most of his peers insisted never would. He diverted staff hours, logistical planning, reconnaissance flights, and command focus toward a scenario that might never happen. His officers questioned him. His superiors doubted him. But Patton did not waver because he understood a brutal truth. If Coe was wrong, Third Army lost nothing. If Coe was right, Third Army might save the entire front. That logic, simple, ruthless, strategic, was why Patton alone was ready when the Ardennes exploded. The silence of success. After the war, official histories praised Third Army's rapid turn north and the heroic stand of the 101st Airborne. But the 11 days of preparation that made it possible were reduced to footnotes, and Oscar Coe, the man who saw the storm forming before anyone else felt the wind, was barely mentioned outside specialized studies. Yet for students of command and intelligence, the lesson was unmistakable. The greatest failures are born from certainty. The greatest victories are born from preparation. The Battle of the Bulge exposed both. When the last German units withdrew from the shattered remnants of their Bulge, the Ardennes lay scarred by fire, wreckage, and the frozen bodies of men from both sides. For the United States, the Battle of the Bulge would become the costliest single engagement of the European war. Over Dix, 0. -0 Americans killed, nearly 50, 0. -0 wounded, and tens of thousands captured or missing. It was a victory written in blood, ice, and stubborn endurance. But as the smoke cleared, a deeper story, one that had played out long before the first shell fell, began to emerge. A story about perception, leadership, and the thin line between foresight and folly. The war everyone thought was already won. By December 1944, almost every Allied commander believed the war was entering its final phase. The Wehrmacht was retreating. The Luftwaffe was crippled. Fuel shortages were so desperate that German armored units often abandoned tanks for lack of gasoline. To most generals, the idea of a massive German offensive through the Ardennes wasn't simply unlikely, it was impossible, and so intelligence reports, prisoner statements, and recon sightings were all filtered through a lens of expectation. Germany is finished. Therefore, anything that looks like preparation for an attack must be misinterpreted. This optimism was understandable, but it was also blinding. The greatest risk in warfare is not the enemy you see, but the enemy you assume cannot act. The only commander who asked, "What if they're wrong?" George S. Patton did not see himself as a genius, but he did pride himself on something far more practical. He questioned assumptions always, relentlessly, even when they came from above. When Coe presented his analysis, Patton didn't require absolute proof. He didn't demand unanimous agreement. He didn't dismiss the warning simply because it contradicted the prevailing narrative. He asked a single brutal question to one, "What if this is right?" And the instant he accepted that possibility, everything else followed. Prepare contingency plans, redirect reconnaissance, analyze logistics for 90 degrees turn, identify which divisions could disengage fastest, position fuel and ammunition for rapid movement, train staffs to rehearse scenarios no one else imagined. Patton understood that certainty is a luxury commanders cannot afford. He prepared not because he knew disaster was coming, but because he recognized the cost of not preparing if it did. That distinction is what separated him from every other general in the room at Verdun. Speed was the effect. Preparation was the cause. To the public, Patton's pivot north seemed like a miracle of operational maneuver. An army turning 90 degrees in winter, marching more than 100 miles, and attacking within 48 hours. But the miracle wasn't movement. The miracle was timing. By the time Eisenhower asked, "Who can attack north and how soon?" Patton's answer wasn't boldness. It was simply the truth. He could move in 48 hours because he had already moved in his mind. 11 days earlier, while others saw snow, quiet villages, and a safe sector, Patton saw what Coe saw, a gap in the line that an ambitious enemy could exploit. And because he accepted that possibility, he built the only plan that could meet the crisis when it arrived. Speed was not improvisation. Speed was preparation, executed, the forgotten intelligence officer. In most retellings of the Battle of the Bulge, Oscar is mentioned only in passing, if he is mentioned at all. But in professional military circles, his analysis is studied as one of the most accurate intelligence assessments of the war. Cook didn't possess magical insight. He wasn't granted classified information unavailable to others. He simply refused to ignore data that contradicted comfortable assumptions, and he refused to let pressure, consensus, or optimism shape his conclusions. His quiet insistence that Germany was preparing for a major offensive was not what anyone wanted to hear, but it was what someone needed to hear, and Patton was the only commander who did. The lesson hidden beneath the snow. When historians summarize the Battle of the Bulge, they often highlight the heroism at Bastogne, the ferocity of the German assault, the brutality of winter, and the scale of the American counterattack. But beneath all of that lies a quieter truth. The battle was won before the first shot was fired. It was won in a small intelligence office where a single officer refused to bend the facts. It was won in Patton's command tent where a general trusted analysis over consensus. It was won when a plan for a nightmare scenario was drawn up not because it seemed likely, but because ignoring it seemed dangerous. Most commanders prepare for the future they expect. Patton prepared for the future he feared, and that made all the difference. The legacy of a decision no one saw. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge failed to break the Allied line. It failed to split their armies. It failed to reach Antwerp. It failed to achieve any of Hitler's ambitious goals. But it succeeded in revealing something else, which leaders understood war as it truly is: uncertain, unforgiving, and merciless toward those who wait for certainty. Patton was the only general ready for Battle of the Bulge, not because he was reckless, not because he was lucky, but because he believed in a principle too often forgotten. When danger is uncertain, preparation is the only certainty you control. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, that belief saved an army. It saved a town, and it may well have shortened the war. The world remembers Bastogne because of its heroism, but history was shaped by the quiet decision 11 days earlier. The decision no one else thought necessary, the decision to be ready. In the decades since the winter of 944, the story of the Battle of the Bulge has been told and retold in books, in documentaries, in classrooms, and around kitchen tables by the men who survived it. But for all the courage shown in those frozen forests, for all the sacrifices made in snow-filled foxholes, and for all the desperate miles fought by tank crews and infantrymen, there remains a part of the story that is often overshadowed by the thunder of battle. The part that happened in silence, the part that required no gunfire, no heroics on the line, not dramatic charge into enemy defenses. The part where one intelligence officer refused to ignore the truth in front of him, and one general refused to ignore the man who saw it. Oscar Coe's analysis never made headlines. His name does not appear in most popular histories of the war. But without him, the German offensive might have reached the Meuse. Bastogne might have fallen, the Allied armies might have been split, and the final shape of the war in Europe might have been far darker. George S. Patton's achievement turning an army on a dime, attacking in 48 hours, and saving a town surrounded on all sides, has become legend. But legends are often simplified. The truth is sharper, getter, and more important. Patton did not win because he was fearless. He won because he prepared when everyone else believed there was nothing to prepare for. He trusted an uncomfortable report. He challenged comforting assumptions. And he acted before certainty arrived because he knew that in war, certainty rarely comes until it is too late. That is the real legacy of the Battle of the Bulge. Not just the heroism of the 101st Airborne, nor the endurance of the tank crews who fought through ice and fire, but the reminder that foresight can be as decisive as firepower. If you want to understand leadership, strategy, and the thin line between disaster and victory, the story of Patton at Bastogne is not just history. It is a lesson written in snow and steel, and paid for by the men who marched through both. If you'd like to hear more untold stories like this, hidden decisions, forgotten warnings, and moments that quietly shaped the outcome of World War II, make sure to stay with this channel. There are many more battles behind the battles still left to uncover.